All right, guys, thanks for joining me today. I'm really excited about the session that we're going to do. We're going to talk all things go-to-market strategy, process, and technology, from sales leadership to RevOps to Salesforce administration. To do a quick round of intros, I've got Kevin, the head of sales at Proco AI, who has about 14 years of experience in varying stages of sales leadership. We have Scott and Jerry from our team. Scott is one of our senior RevOps consultants and has spent the last 10 years in senior sales and marketing ops roles at 5 different companies, including Salesforce itself. And Jerry, our senior Salesforce consultant, has spent the last 15 years both as a consultant and internal administering and managing Salesforce and running tech ops. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to have what I think will turn into somewhat of a fireside chat around all things go-to-market strategy, process, and technology. So I want to launch in here and I want to throw out the first topic. So we've broken up sort of RevOps into about 6 different categories, and the first of which, the highest level, is strategy and organization. And I want to start and see where this conversation flows with you, Kevin, and ask you, what do you think when you hear strategy and organization when it comes to go-to-market? What does that mean to you? And what are some of the things that you've done in the roles that you've had to try to plan for that?
To me, strategy is basically it's our game plan. It's our playbook. It's how we're going to go achieve our goals. And so there's a lot of different layers to that, whether it's comes into territories, the types of accounts and personas you're targeting, how you're targeting. But it's really just, the plan, the game plan on how you're going to hit your numbers. So it does need to be fairly data driven and say, hey, here's what we need to do from a goals perspective, a KPIs metrics perspective, and show. I always like showing sort of our math of sales or our sales plan on how we're going to get there. But then it does go deeper into the who, the what, and the how. But I think for my experience, there's been various levels of input and contribution to a go-to-market strategy. I think there's somebody who is accountable for it, but when it comes to whether it's sales leadership, rev and sales ops, even marketing contribution, I look at a whole revenue team. There are a lot of contributors that will kind of feed into that overall go-to-market strategy.
I think that's a really helpful answer. And we've got a number of players from that team here today. That's the whole point of the call. So I'll go to you next, Scott. I'm curious on your perspective on what you think when you hear the term strategy and organization, and specifically what role RevOps plays in working with leadership as well as Salesforce consultants, administrators, and other people that manage the tools to put that all together.
Sure. So from a RevOps perspective, it's kind of a hot topic. How is it different from sales ops or marketing ops or finance ops? And the answer is, it's a little bit of all those things. Prior to this concept of a centralized RevOps group, each of those business units or functions have operational teams, and they're very valuable. But often their solutioning is prioritized from the one business unit, and so you don't get the complete picture. So if sales is solving for territories with all their point of view, they might not factor in what marketing is going to be doing and how they're going to be blanketing this region or this tactic in certain ways. And so RevOps, when you think about strategy and operations, is endeavoring to bring those groups together operationally so that the strategy is factoring in all of those agendas and priorities in one time. And so that's how I see it differently from a RevOps perspective. It's becoming its own unit that is intelligent enough. It's had experience in those areas, but then also expertise in operational rigor. Technology has really changed how operationally you can do marketing, sales, all these things. It's not just CRM. There's so many layers of applications and tools, the way these people accomplish their work, that RevOps has become a specialty. How do you help match the tool to now this broad strategy that's factoring in the needs of finance, marketing, customer success, sales, all these groups it takes to be the revenue unit?
That makes a lot of sense. Jerry, I'd love to hear your perspective, and specifically maybe it seems to me that you've seen both sides of this, where what Kevin and Scott are describing have been done well and when it hasn't. And when the onus falls on you to make the tools work, how much of a difference does that make? What have you seen in your experience with teams that have this all aligned and teams that don't?
Yeah, it's a good point. Well, I will say that when it comes to strategy, for me, uh, being in a position of being responsible for the technology and implementation, I actually consider the technology last, because I think it is critical that whoever is in charge of that, whether it's myself or someone else, has as deep, if not the deepest understanding of the strategy across functionalities and teams within the org. If you don't, and then you implement technology solutions, uh, it's a lot easier to pivot at a theoretical level if things weren't aligned than it is from a technology level. So it's really important to understand and get things right as early as possible in the process so you don't build yourself into a corner. So when teams have things done right, decisions are being made, teams are aligned, it makes it really easy for someone like myself to get a full 360-degree view of what the plan is and what the goals are and how they're looking to accomplish those goals, and then determine how technology fits into that. When teams aren't aligned, or when the decision-making process is not done and it's trying to be done and there's still conflict maybe, it slows the process down, it creates a lot of tension, and then you end up, in many cases, building something or implementing solutions that aren't really a good fit, and you may not notice it in the short term, but it will rear its head over the medium to long term. And then you end up, it ends up being more of a cost to the business, whether it's time or money or both. Even morale can drop. You have poor adoption over time. So it's really critical that the organization has a good sense of strategy and there's alignment before we come in and start helping them make decisions on the technology.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's something that I see in our work a lot, is that you have customers or companies really that are frustrated that things aren't working. And it's like, it's not working because we put the cart before the horse. We're trying to get the system to work and get people to use it, but there's no plan behind it. And so often I think that we're at the mercy when we're working with external customers that, if they don't have someone like Kevin in the seat that's really thinking thoughtfully, or maybe somebody that just wants to delegate this down the chain, we're trying to put tools together and we don't know what we're ultimately trying to accomplish.
What I see often, an example of that is even something like integrating different platforms. I've worked with teams where we have, platforms X, Y, and Z and Salesforce. We want to integrate them all with Salesforce. I've learned over the years that the first question I should ask shouldn't be, how soon do you want it done? But it actually should be, why? What is the reason why you want to do this? Because often the answer is, well, we should because we have it. And my response to that is, that's not a good reason to do that. You're introducing more mechanics into a system that it may not be necessary for. So you take that same concept as to the underlying why, and that should go across all the decisions that are being made. So to your point, you shouldn't put the cart before the horse because it won't work out.
Yeah, I was going to say that like the planning side, that's perspective, right? So if you look at the business units, sales and marketing, they're often being tasked with obviously looking forward, where are we going, growth on top of growth, or the here and now, how to execute. But that leaves very little time to look backwards and learn from what you've already accomplished or failed at. And that's often what feeds into a better plan, is informing it with what's been in place, matched with what's possible. So that understanding tools, technology, how you can now think about solving that problem differently. And that's more of the RevOps approach to it, as a dedicated group that is additional support. So like it's unreasonable to ask the sales team to spend a lot of time looking backwards while they're the team that has to drive us forward, or marketing as well. So it's supporting those groups and compiling what we've learned from what they've already executed against so we can do it better tomorrow.
Well, and that's part of the reason I wanted to bring us all together, was to dive into that. It's like, I think it's really easy for people to get confused, and I can put this on you, Kevin. Like, why can't you do all this yourself, right? So what's the difference between what you would do in terms of thinking about your analytics, thinking about what sales strategies are working and what they're not, versus where you might turn to someone like Scott or Jerry for help?
Yeah, this particular topic I think is a really interesting one for me, because I have been hired as that, sales leader who is supposed to be not just the sales leader, but the operational guy, the reporting guy, the sales enablement guy, the training guy, right? And as we're seeing, there is such a higher importance and a specialty in RevOps because it truly is a specialty and it truly is incredibly valuable. And so you're seeing that this, one person can't wear every hat. You're seeing sales enablement pop up much more in the spotlight as what's helping drive revenue and help teams grow. So I've been in that position where you have to wear all of those hats. And it's never pretty, right? But with a bit of trial and error, you just have to figure out where the priorities are and what's going to drive the biggest impact. And there's going to be things that are important that, especially in earlier stage companies, you're just going to have to say, unfortunately, until we can get RevOps in place, we just can't really put a lot of time and attention to it because as one person, you only have so much bandwidth. And I think that's where, you see a lot of heads of sales and VPs of sales failing because they're expected to do it all, which is just not a realistic thing. But I think when you once you start to get into whether it's larger companies, more mature companies, or companies that are understanding the value of, say, operations, I think on the operations side too, which is really interesting, is because it's a bit on it's rising in notoriety, and it's something still, I think, fairly new to a lot of organizations. And when you see RevOps professionals, they have different skill sets. And so I think depending on the organization, depending on the people, you're probably going to see a bit of a different relationship between that sales leader and that the people within operations. Today, it's not really a one-size-fits-all model or relationship.
Well, this might cue up a pretty straightforward question. In an ideal scenario, what are your expectations of someone in RevOps?
I think there's two kind of ends, and I would say if I look at the RevOps team, I think there's two sort of ends to that spectrum. I think the one end of the spectrum is very much strategic, analytical, and then I think on the other end of the spectrum, it's very much like tactical. Right, and that's more maybe within systems. It's more within your CRM or integrating, technologies and things of that nature. As a sales leader, I've spent a lot of time not just trying to build the reports and look at the numbers, but then try and make sense of the numbers as well. So I think there is this partnership where, as a sales leader, you want to be out in front of customers. You want to be, in the trenches with your team, looking at where to go next. Again, like Scott, I think the way you put it was great, like very much looking forward on what we need to do. I think where the partnership really comes in nicely is when the operational side can say, hey, like, here's what's happening. Here's what I'm seeing. Here's what I'm thinking. Let's talk about it. What are you seeing? What insights are you pulling from this, data or analysis or whatever it may be? So, but I think, like I said, I think every relationship in every organization is very different, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I don't know, I kind of feel the same way. I think that you and I have somewhat similar backgrounds in that we both spent the bulk of our career in a sales role, but we're also relatively technical and analytical. And the problem with that is like you might have some vague notion of what you might need to do and maybe even how to do it. But that doesn't mean that you know how to do it proficiently or efficiently in comparison to someone like Jerry. And it also doesn't mean that you know that you have the time to do it. And I think like for me, when I'm thinking about everything I'm doing in sales and marketing, first and foremost, I want to maximize my time spent and my team's time spent on those activities. Like, whether it's sales in terms of meeting prospects and clients, whether it's marketing in terms of producing content, events, and getting it distributed to the right people. I want the systems to work, and I want somebody bringing analytics to me to say, here's what's working and here's what's not. You need to double down on this activity and back away from this activity because this is what's going to drive impact and drive revenue in your organization. And it's just no way that I can find time to do all of those things myself, nor do I have the expertise that someone like Scott or Jerry has.
Enabling smart and efficient growth in a way, right? Where what I think we're going to see in the future is instead of adding more quota carrying headcount, you're going to start building that supporting cast around the sales team, right? So instead of these monster sales organizations, right, you may have half the salespeople selling double the amount, but it's because they've got people like Jerry and Scott, and they have sales enablement, and they have this supporting cast around that's, allowing them to do more than what an inefficient salesperson can do.
Well, that's what my experience was when I joined Salesforce. I came from a small tech company where we didn't have any of that support. So as a sales rep, I had to, build all my own stuff in Salesforce. I had to build my own reports, import my own data, figure out my own analytics. And my productivity was really taxed because of that. And then you go into an organization like Salesforce and it's literally served up to you on a silver platter. And I'm completely glazing over enablement, but we had all of that too, right? Yeah, I think that it just, I agree with you. And I think I would turn this to Jerry and Scott. Like, what are some of the things that you guys have seen in terms of people that you've worked with or organizations you've worked with where they may have too much headcount in sales and nothing else, and the struggles that are associated with that?
The evolution of RevOps isn't to say like to replace marketing ops or sales ops. It's additive. And what I like about separating it from the individual business units is you get to ask those tough questions. Should we add territories here? What is working in marketing? Where should we adjust budget? But if you ask those questions to the teams that are beholden to the business unit themselves, it's really difficult for them to tell the tough truth. But I also acknowledge that to run the business, there's a heavy lift of operational rigor that's needed just to run the business. So you're going to find that each of those business units often have an operations person. It's like the right-hand person of the sales leader, of the marketing leader. And I don't believe that RevOps replaces that. I think those people still exist in the business units because they are that critical, and they're basically the power users of RevOps support. And so when they identify something that needs a deeper dive, they are the biggest partner into what is a centralized RevOps group. Hey, listen, we've uncovered something. We got to keep moving forward, but I'd like for you to go figure out why the hell this happened and come back to us. So when we do have time, we can innovate.
Makes sense. Jerry, what have you seen in this regard?
There's a couple of things to bear in mind. There's differences I find between the role as a consultant versus somebody in-house. I think then that further it depends on the company. As the other thing to consider is who you're interacting with, whether you're in-house or a consultant. Are you engaged directly with senior executives, or are you engaged directly with sales leadership, or both? Because to use the first example, as a consultant, it can be a little bit hairy, where we've had clients that maybe aren't as engaged with the idea of proactive reporting, or aren't as receptive to the idea of looking at different metrics and different analytics. There can be some stubbornness. So that's inherently going to be a roadblock to trying to help. If they're receptive to it, then it's a great thing to be able to be proactive and provide insight into areas that maybe they aren't focusing on.
I think this is a pretty interesting conversation. It's so interesting to think about like who's responsible for what. And Kevin, to your point that you made earlier, I think it's really fascinating to see how I think that we've seen like a case where sales has been segmented into these different specializations, and now you're seeing sort of like sales leadership being segmented into different specializations as well, from the sales leader, so to speak, like yourself, to the people responsible for the tech, to the people responsible for RevOps, to the people responsible for enablement, to all kinds of other things. And I think it all kind of comes into the idea that you shared, Kevin, which is like, how do we make our reps more effective? And the reason for that is because it's so incredibly difficult to recruit, hire, and train good salespeople that can consistently meet quota and close deals. And to find those folks and then just put them into a scenario where they're fighting uphill battles and constantly jumping over hurdles, it just seems increasingly unwise year after year after year, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, you waste a lot of time, a lot of money, even just a lot of your own like energy, right? Like training. If you really think about what you put into your sales reps to do well, and even what they put into it, there's so much, right? There's so much training and energy and support that goes into all of this stuff. And so if they don't have the right support, whether that is through training, whether it's through understanding operationally and what works, what doesn't work, how to use the tools the most effective way, um, it's a really tough job, and you can be losing really talented, great people that just because they didn't have the right support aren't going to thrive in that particular environment. So I think when you look at the right ways, the smart ways to kind of grow your sales organization, I think, like I said, I really see it as this way of building a supporting cast to enable that. And then, to an extent too, Scott, like you mentioned, it's sort of building this connective tissue and bringing all these different organizations together that do enable the company's success, whether it's, sales and marketing. We haven't even touched on customer success and upsells and renewals and that whole, component to how that drives, success within the business and what that strategy is. So, there's a lot of layers to it, but I think once you start getting these kind of building blocks together, that's sort of the first phase of building that alignment.
Yeah. And I'd love to pivot a little bit and dive into some specifics. And I want to talk about data analytics for a bit. And I want to ask you, Kevin, first, and then kind of go around the horn on, what do you consider yourself responsible for in terms of analytics, and what are you looking to others to help you with?
It's a good question. I've been in organizations where I've had the support of sales or rev operations. I've also been in organizations that I'm that guy also. Depending on the resources and the support that I do have available to me, a lot of the time though, like in the most simple manner, again, Eddie, this because we've worked, we know each other for a while and we worked together for a while, but I'm very analytical in my sales planning and my math of sales. And so I break down my numbers. I understand what conversions have to look like, what, activity levels need to look like, and just so I have a basis, right? So you have a plan and you can kind of start operating off of that. But for me, if I don't have the support, I, try and take more of that minimalist approach and understand, what are the absolute must-have KPIs that I need to measure and that I need to understand that are going to allow me to, keep my finger on the pulse, understanding how things are moving through the funnel of the process. If I have the support, I love diving deeper. I love the postmortems and look backs. But again, sometimes it's not possible with having to, ultimately drive the revenue and bring it in. So, it has been very case by case for me based on what's available.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I was on a call just before this where somebody was asking me some basic questions, and it seems like it's so dependent. Like when you're thinking about analytics, the way I think of it is what is the hypothesis you're trying to test? So if we think that we're trying to build an outbound program, and let's be specific, we're going to build an outbound program for SMB, and we're going to call into these folks, and we're going to try to set meetings and convert those meetings into opportunities, and then close won customers. The hypothesis is that if we put in this input, we get this output. If we make X amount of calls or do these type of calls or these types of activities, we close this type of business. And to me, when I think about a sales leader, I think about their responsibility being to form that hypothesis, to say, like, in my gut, I feel like if we do A, B, and C based on my experience, based on my knowledge of the market, based on conversations I've had with external and internal parties, I think that this thing might work. But then we've got to test that, right? And we can't get too scientific because then all of a sudden we, miss the forest through the trees. But it seems to me that whether you have a Salesforce administrator or somebody more senior or a RevOps person, it's really beneficial to be able to turn to that person and say, hey, can you help validate what we're trying to do here? A, are people executing this strategy? And B, is it working? Is it producing our expected result, and or is it worth continuing down this path? Scott, I'd be curious on your insights here. Like, to what extent do you see sales leaders thinking that way or not thinking that way? And where do you try to come in and add value to that conversation?
Well, there's definitely no shortage of information. We live in the information age, as Salesforce would say. And So that's a blessing and a curse. You can almost get distracted with how many things we can measure now. So I think part of a good operational rigor is identifying which things really matter. It's kind of the difference I call the difference between need to know and need to know. And often we can get really enamored with the neat things. But partnering with sales and marketing, what are the critical few, your KPIs, if you will? They're telling us if we're winning or losing. And if you want to give an example, like difference of a classical ops versus maybe what rev ops might do, pipeline. If you look at your trend for the quarter, you think you got plenty of pipeline, I'm going to hit my number. And you get to the end of the quarter, the last week, and what you thought was going to close this quarter, all of a sudden 40% of it just moved to the end of next quarter. Very predictable behavior for sales teams. Never happens, right? Just hear me out. But from a classical ops perspective, you can only use what you have available. So I'm going to create some kind of spreadsheet that's going to track it, and I'm going to hold people accountable that way. Hard to do. A RevOps perspective says, all right, keep doing your stuff. We're going to go back with the data modelers and figure out how we can make that a measurable metric. The number of times something pushes, make that visible inside of CRM. So now you have this additional way to understand the quality of your pipeline, the health of your pipeline, if you will. So now your operational teams in the business units can factor that into how they're advising their sales leaders, their marketing leaders.
Yeah, and so I'm going to give you a bit of a layup here, Kevin. As a sales leader, what do you do with that information?
You know what though? It's really, really interesting though, because I mean, first and foremost to me, like the having data behind the quality of your pipeline is something that I feel like everyone's kind of chasing. Some do well, some don't. But the biggest thing to me on that one, and I'm not sure if this is what you were looking for or not, Eddie, but to me, it's coaching moments, right? I love being able to use analytics and data to point me on how to coach my team, how to make them better, how to drive a better result. Um, the way I've always looked at it, it's like, if you have someone who's like, just go make sales better, go build sales, go like, it's like trying to boil the ocean, right? But if the quality of the pipeline allows me, and I have data that kind of points me in a direction that says, you know what, we're losing deals or deals are slipping because we're not tying down timelines. We're not really fully understanding the need. We're not understanding that what happens if we miss a timeline, right? There's different ways that I think that the data can actually help you understand how to coach and make your team better. So for me, I love using the analytics and data as pointing me where to coach.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. And that is exactly where I was trying to go with that. I thought, I think it was Kevin Dorsey that put this out in some kind of a public LinkedIn event. And he talked about coaching his reps on how to get to their number and using the data in the CRM to help them design their own plan. And I forget the exact example he used, but I think it was something like he was saying, well, you need to make 126 calls to book a meeting. Or maybe to book a new opportunity, right? And you need this many opportunities. This is your close rate, yada, yada, yada. And so what number would you like to be at this year? And of course the rep says, well, I want to crush my quota. I want to be at 100%, 120%, what have you, right? Okay, well then in order to do that, based on the numbers that we're seeing in the CRM, you would need to make 250 calls a day. And the rep is like, whoa, I have to make 200. Nobody wants to make 250 calls a day. I barely want to make 25 calls a day. Say, okay, all right, so we don't want to make 250 calls a day. Well, what are we going to change then? Where do we need to work on this? And now you have buy-in from your rep to say, oh man, I really need to improve my conversion rate from cold calls to meetings, or from meetings to opportunities, or from opportunities to closed won. How can we work on that? And now you have your rep bought into the idea that I want coaching on how to improve this instead of it coming at them involuntarily.
Yeah, and I'll expand on that. I like what you said, Kevin, identifying coachable moments or areas that will add to what is existing process. So like in that example, we're talking about making phone calls, but maybe that industry has shifted. Maybe that interaction's happening on LinkedIn right now. And maybe we need to help the sales teams understand how to engage on LinkedIn. Not just because you have a license there doesn't mean everybody knows how to be effective in reaching out on LinkedIn. And so that's kind of an evolution of how you might drive demand as industries and teams evolve. And so I think that's where my mind went. And it's not possible to do 250 calls, but maybe we need to be touching them in different tactics.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I was going to dive in here and I was going to touch on sort of this issue of collecting data and having accurate data that we can then analyze. And Scott, you and I have talked a lot about how so many companies want to analyze things only to uncover that they don't have the data to do it, right? So we have this double-edged sword problem. On one end, you have some people that go down the wrong path and they want to track every single data point under the sun, which never actually works because no proficient salesperson is going to enter 25 pieces of data every time they get off the phone. It's just never, ever going to happen, right? And at the same time, if you're not tracking the data that's critical for the hypothesis you want to test, or the thing you're trying to figure out, whether it's a coaching moment, Kevin, whether it's a pivot to strategy, then you're going to end up in a place where you don't have that data to run the analysis. And Jerry, I feel like you've seen this more than anybody. How often do customers ask you to run some analysis? Do you then find out that we just don't have the data, and all of a sudden, A, we've got a huge project, and then B, we have to wait months or years for that data to then be populated?
Less often now than I would have said 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, because I think I've gotten better at thinking about that right on the onset of an engagement with a company, to try to think ahead of what are the things that are likely going to come up. What do we see get asked most often in terms of those analytics and data points that, let's say, Salesforce doesn't give you just out of the box, that don't require additional setup. So I know I've made a point to plan for that ahead of time. Most of the time these are things that are transparent. They're behind the scenes. They're not asks of sales to have to enter in additional data. So we try to get ahead of it. But then there are some things that do require, direct interaction with the sales team. So we'll try to suss out what those KPIs and metrics may be as early on in an engagement as possible, so that we can be collecting the data from day one.
That makes sense. Anybody else have any thoughts on that before I ask any other questions?
No, yeah, my mind was going around. That's a very common challenge. We want to be able to measure something, but we acknowledge we actually didn't capture it. So now we go back and tell the team, I need you to put this field in for every opportunity. I need you to do these 3 steps. When I already asked, they're already committed to doing 12. And so you start to hit this point of diminishing returns where you're stretching the trust you have with your sales team or your marketing team. So why do I got to do this extra thing again? So in order to maintain that trust, you have to be able to articulate the value of why you're asking them to do some of these administrative steps. So if I'm asking you to tell me why or the competitor we lost the deal to, I'm sure you guys have noticed that if you don't articulate the value, the answer you're going to get is the first answer in the dropdown. That's going to be the one that everybody selects because they don't realize how it changes their day-to-day life if they actually told you the truth. And so that's back on the team that's asking them to capture it. If I'm going to make you or ask that you do the work, I need to come back and make it real for you about what it turns into on the other side.
Yeah, I really like that because I've also been in the situations where we want to look at data, but we never tracked it, right? And it's well, we got to start somewhere. And then Eddie, to your point, it's about building out a hypothesis on what the number should be and going out and testing it. But using any of these tools, whether it's a CRM, you even go to these really cool solutions like Gong and Chorus. There's just so much that sales tech right now is outrageous. There's so much out there, and I think very, very often companies say, "Oh, we've got to fix this, or we've got this problem. We've got a challenge here," and they just try and throw tech at it. And to your point, Scott, it's about the change management, the actual behaviors in the person that are going to want to have to change to start doing the work. Right. And there's so many times where there's fields added and extra steps taken into the sales process that the reps don't understand, what's in it for me? Why am I doing this extra work? And unfortunately, that's just the reality of how a lot of sales reps think. And so bringing it back to how it benefits them, how it's helpful for themselves, their performance, the business, anything is so crucial. And I think that those steps to think about the change management is not thought about enough when it comes to anything tech related.
Yeah, I was going to say from an operational standpoint, one of the measures I take for success is, can we take friction out of processes? And so if you find yourself saying, well, let's just ask that team to do this extra thing, have you really exhausted what's possible what technology exists today. So I need to track every time you do this significant phone call. So yeah, you got cold calls, but what I really care about is when you hold that 30-minute pitch that's over Zoom. Well, I'll give you a real example. One of the companies I was consulting with, that was what they were doing. And they were asking the sales reps to go back in after they made their phone call, if it was one of those 30-minute ones, to check a box in Salesforce to say that call was one of the significant KPIs. Well, then they weren't doing it. It was just an extra administrative step. It wasn't used to change anything in their day-to-day life. It was just used to show up on a report that they never saw. And so it was this constant fight back and forth between the leadership and the sales makers. Why aren't you doing this? They're like, oh, okay, I'll do it. And then they don't. But no one asked the question, well, can we make the system just do that for them? If in their day-to-day job, they hold the call, can the system be expanded to be smart enough to identify the difference and make that checkbox automatically? And the answer was yes. But it took a lot of fighting where somebody asked that question. They kept saying, well, how do we get them to do it? How do we punish them? Who should be driving this? Should the manager do it? Should the senior person on the team? We didn't get to the point of how do we do this better until months down the road. And we eventually did. We eventually automated that checkpoint. So now the reporting was more accurate. Decisions could be made. And we took the administrative burden off the sales team.
What'd you do to accomplish that, Scott?
It was a mixture of CRM integration with the Zoom tool and some customization.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Internally here, we've on our sales team set it up where you just put the right title into the calendar invite. And then there's an integration between the calendar and Salesforce, and then it goes into a report based on filter criteria. And so all you have to do is title the same meeting with the same title, not even the whole title, just contains, every time we meet with an account executive at Salesforce, it just says AE partner meeting. Anything that says AE partner goes into the report, and it shows us how many meetings we had with Salesforce folks. It's really simple, and it's not onerous on anybody. It even goes into Calendly. And so if somebody books a meeting on my Calendly, it just automatically goes into the report. So now there's zero human effort going in to generate this. And it sounds like you're doing the same thing just with Zoom. And Jerry, I know we did a pretty big project trying to work out some stuff around the limitations of Zoom's integration.
Now, I'll give you an expansion on what you just said. In an SMB or a smaller company, that can work. You're doing hashtags or labels, if you will, where you're searching the entire text field. Now, if you extrapolate that out to a Dell where there's 130,000 employees, the system it takes to comb through that field and look at every character is a lot of resources compared to another data kind of structure. If that's going to be something you do all the time, potentially that's another drop down or a regulated field. So you have to kind of match the solutions with the size of the need or the company. But for what you just described, I bet that works really good.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And when I worked at Salesforce, that's obviously a very large organization that couldn't have a hack like the one that I just shared. We would have to manually enter those meetings, unfortunately. But what we would do is we would just type it. We would log a call in Salesforce and type in F to F. And that was just something my team of 6 people did. And then the report that we ran filtered for F to F, as in face to face. And that's it. And so it's a little bit of a manual entry, but when we were actually logging our notes from the meetings, we would do that. And so it's not as automated as the examples you and I shared. But at the same time, you're still getting these significant reports within a large organization where you can't put a hack together.
I think it also depends on how you present it to the user. Out of the box, let me use Salesforce as an example. You go to log a call, and that's what we're talking about, asking a sales rep to check some extra boxes or use a pick list. Get rid of that. Have 2 different buttons for different kinds of calls. So right up front, the first thing they're thinking of is, I've got to pick one of these. It's really easy to just choose the right one. I think that sometimes is disruptive in a positive way enough to collect that, because if they click the F to F, log F to F call button, they don't have to do anything extra. We know behind the scenes that's going to be a face-to-face meeting. If they choose, something else, then we know what that is. So there's other more subtle ways too with how you present, the interaction with Salesforce to try to systematize or standardize things like that.
I think that's such a great tip, and it comes into the whole thing that we started with here, which is, for me, when I've been a sales rep, as somebody selling, even to this day, I want somebody to bring insights to me. I'm willing to put in a little bit of effort, not too much, because I got to focus my time on customers and prospects. But I want somebody to come and say, hey, this is what's working best for you, and this is what's not. And if you refocus your energy here, you're going to have more success.
Yeah, I think sometimes people get caught up because they think that information equals insight, and it doesn't. It's about the mining of information down into usable parts to get you the insight. And you're trying to find the fastest path to that. That's what I think about when operations and analytics. A lot of folks are, data science is a pretty hot topic right now. And that's more about, can we predict what's going to happen or make it happen? But what I see often in organizations is they've made assumptions that they've already matured past descriptive analytics, like what happened, and don't realize you're not even measuring 3 of the critical inputs you need to predict the future. And so what I encourage folks is, let's just at least do an audit. Like, how well are we describing the business and what happened today? And if we feel like the whole picture is there, we can move into the next steps. But I've never done that and figured out that we had everything we needed to measure without going through that audit.
I was just going to say we're at time, and I want to make sure everybody can get to their next meeting. But you guys, this has been awesome. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Great.